Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
And we're back with another episode of Socializing Security. We want to take some time to introduce our guest speaker who will be socializing with us on today's episode about workplace abuse and ending workplace psychological abuse. So we will be speaking with Kimberly Williams, who is a personal friend of mine and is a HR guru. I will say she's worked in the State Department and has held many different positions in human resources. And she's currently the Vice President of People, Culture, and Compliance for Walker Advertising. She's also an advisory council member and spokesperson for the End Workplace Abuse movement. So we are going to be talking to her about the importance of this. I do think this ties into some of the previous conversations we've had, especially about hacking, mental health hackers, and tying into employee experience within technology companies of making sure that nobody feels this way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's obviously a huge part of mental health is having a safe space. And if work is not a safe space, then people are not going to be at their best. Not being at their best is not only from a mental health perspective, but quite frankly, it makes you a safer workspace because we've talked many times, many other episodes, about how, one of the ways that attackers use to, particularly the social engineering, is to try and rush you, to try and make you feel like you need to immediately act on something. And when you're in a space, in a mental space where you feel like you're being attacked all the time, where you feel like you're constantly on the defensive, when you feel like you can't be yourself at work, that puts you on edge, and it means that you are going to be more reactive and you are going to jump at things, positive or negative. And that reaction is one of those things that, as we talk about the people aspects of technical security, that you need to make sure that your people are in a mental state that they can pause, look at that thing, say, are they trying to get me to react immediately through emotion? And then to be able to understand that intellectually and not just be emotional about it.
Yeah, and this is something that I think most employees can probably understand in a situation where they might have experienced some type of workplace abuse. And so I think it's something that is close to both of us, but we definitely want to hear too from Kim. She's an avid advocate for this particular movement. And it's exciting to see, and she's done some really amazing things with it, and it's a little bit of a different type of episode for us, but it's something that I think you and I care a lot about. We're talking about the Workplace Psychological Safety Act, and that's really comes down to workplace psychological abuse is employee exploitation according to this bill. And so we're definitely going to bring in Kim. We want to introduce her and just what she's working on with the End Workplace Abuse movement and learn more about the bill and how we can support.
Yeah, let's do it. And we're back with Kim. Kim, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you give a quick introduction so people can kind of hear your voice?
Sure. My name is Kim Williams. I'm VP of People, Culture, and Compliance with Walker Advertising, and I'm also a spokesperson for End Workplace Abuse.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're having today. This is definitely something that I know that I've experienced this before in my professional career, so it's definitely something we want to shine a light on, especially with our technology audience, of why this is so important. And so, Kim, I would love to just hear from you of, what is it that you're defining as workplace psychological abuse? What is it that is at the heart of this movement?
So a lot of it is health harming, but also I think you can really lean on the EEOC definition of harassment. I think is a good place to start too. And so if you look at their descriptors, it's very, very clear. Like if someone is humiliating you, if you're being screamed at in meetings in a public way, if you're being shut out of meetings so that it's impairing your ability to do your job, and therefore having impacts on your career. That is very clear, but I think as more and more evidence and research comes available, we're also seeing too where this will leave us a scar on your brain the moment it happens, that brain scientists can actually see when workplace trauma happens. We're seeing psychologists that are measuring the level of PTSD from folks who are enduring workplace trauma, and it's pretty much on par with combat veterans. The ties on not just anxiety and depression, but what's happening to immune systems, where we've got doctors coming out saying your breast cancer is a direct result of the toxic environment that you've been in. And so we've really been trying to broaden that a little bit to say that this isn't some nice to have, this is not invisible, but that, when folks go through really traumatic experiences at work, when your career's in danger, your whole life can be in danger. It can affect whether you make rent, whether your kids go to school, how you feed your family. And so it's really, really painful stuff.
Yeah, one thing that I'm use a lot with my kids is that trauma is trauma, and one person's trauma is not going to match another person's trauma, and that's not to minimize what PTSD combat vets are getting, but to elevate people up that have gone through traumatic experiences. You may not get shot in a mass shooting, but just hearing the gunshots can be enough. I've known people who are just like, they freak out sometimes in the same environment, sometimes hearing a loud crack type of a sound just because they couldn't even see anything that was going on. They just could hear it. And it's kind of disturbing when you hear stories like that.
Yeah.
So as we are in those types of environments and, with the research that you've done and the investigation, all that kind of stuff, what are the things that those of us who sit in a cube farm might experience? Like, what are the things that if I'm sitting there and I'm like, have I been abused at work? Am I being scarred with something that's happened? Or what are the things I should look out for to help support the people that may have? Like, what are the signs of that kind of toxic culture?
No, that's a great question. I think to me, like, you have toxic cultures where you don't have accountability. And so, a lot of us know what it feels like if you've been, if you're getting singled out in a meeting in a way that's really degrading and that is getting, personal in its attacks. If there's, and if that's happening with impunity, that's really, really important. And sometimes we've also been seeing studies too where like even bystanders are impacted. So like if I just observe somebody else being hurt, it's going to send shockwaves through me. It's going to impact me, and it's definitely going to impact how I show up and how I contribute. So we can measure this in morale. We can measure this in whether people are now thinking, hey, I don't see a long-term future with this company anymore. I've just watched this happen to my peer. I mean, they're going to be walking on eggshells, or I'm going to be waiting for this to happen to me too. And so when you see that happen in environments where that's kind of on display publicly and no one's engaging with that, they're not having offline conversations, there's no visible sign of any type of discipline that's following up on that, but that person's just allowed to kind of go after folks, we tend to just see where that just gets worse and worse and worse, where the screaming gets louder, the threats get more direct. In some cases they end towards violence, but if not, it can be terrifying for the individual who's really relying on that job to have to endure something like that. But it can show up in so many different forms. I think sometimes we'll have folks say like, oh, I've got Gen Z workers, if I don't buy them a foosball table, are they going to be upset? Like, no, there's a reasonable person standard that we can rely on, where we all know if we see something, if I would not want that to happen to me, is a good place to start.
So generally within organizations, is it usually like a lone actor, or does the culture usually kind of empower multiple people that are kind of doing this to their colleagues?
Yeah, normally it spreads out. I have seen organizations where you've just had like one low-key terrorist at the very top and people were just kind of meek and didn't really say anything and everyone kind of walked on eggshells, but I think that that's more rare, quite frankly. I think, it's almost like a compounding factor. So if you've got a boss that's screaming down at their subordinates and then they're getting scared of having that kind of reaction, then they get panicked and then they scream at their subordinates in their effort to not be screamed at themselves. But it also begins to normalize the behavior, and then you start to see people who say, like this, toughen up, man up, deal with it, this is just our environment. And some people will grow a thicker skin and not think anything of it, usually people who are more powerful and less vulnerable, and then other people's maybe not so much.
Yeah, that's interesting. I used to have a coworker who unfortunately has passed since I worked with him, who was a Marine, and he was a big burly person, and I hate to be the type to diagnose somebody else's situation, but was probably a bit bipolar, because one day he would be your best friend and would be joking and jovial and you enjoyed being able to hang out with him, and the next day he would come by and he'd be banging desks and yelling at people and being very surly. And one day he pulled me aside and had misunderstood something that somebody else had said and was just almost reaming me out like I was a subordinate in the Marine Corps. And it was scary.
Yeah.
And I had to hold my tongue, and I tried to remind myself to stay calm, because getting upset was not going to make the situation any better. And he got done. He slapped his hands on the table, stood up, acted like he was going to walk out. I'm like, don't you want to hear my perspective of the story? Because that's not really the way it's happening. Like, you're getting an interpretation that's not quite correct. I think I pushed back on him just the right amount that
That's good.
he just didn't talk to me for about a week or two.
Okay.
Which is unfortunate, because we had to work together on a mostly daily basis, but it didn't flare up again, and then he was jovial and just fine again. And it was to your point of walking on eggshells. Like, you just never knew which of him was going to show up, and I learned there that a simple miscommunication can spiral really, really fast. And it was one of those situations, looking back, I would have done a better job of reporting it. Because that was a situation that needed to be dealt with. It eventually got dealt with, but it was after I'd left the company, so it took quite a while.
Yeah. No, and you raise a really good point. Like, employees actually have more rights than they realize, and HR is not going to tell you a lot of times, unfortunately. And so it can be really hard to know where the lines are, what you're entitled to. And then even if you do have those rights, your company may not honor them. And so you do have to be really, really careful. But there's so many incredible tools that are coming out now. I mean, we're seeing one website I've been referring a lot of folks to is called Hively.com, so like HIVE-LY.com. And it's an AI program that helps you document abuse and untangle it. And so you can literally chat with it and say, these are the things that happened. It will let you upload like a copy of your handbook, which is so important, because so many company handbooks say we require a respectful environment. If something happens, like above and beyond what the law may say, that we will do an investigation. And so that's a contract between you and your employer. So it can look at that and say, okay, if you report this to an employer and they try and brush it off, in states like Texas, where you guys are, I've actually seen breach of contract cases go for like $100,000, where the employee brought up an issue and it was written in there and they didn't do anything about it. And so some of these programs will even run against local laws and say, hey, in the city of Austin, there's actually extra employee protections that you may not know about, and give you that kind of information that can be really, really helpful.
What are your recommendations if you're within an organization, you see something happening? Is the best option to report it to HR? Is that still like the best option for most people?
The best option is definitely to document it on something outside of your work computer. There's another really good program, it's called Work Receipts, and it's an app that you can download, so you don't have to use like a work computer. So it's on your phone, and you can when you first set it up, it takes all your information, it gets your employer, it gets your colleagues, it gets all the background information, and so with very quick taps, you can go in there and it'll timestamp an event. So like if your colleague is screaming at you, you can hit that button and timestamp it. You can even record them. You want to be careful around that, of course, because some states that may not be legal, so depending on where you are. But you can also talk into that. And it'll kind of organize this information. I always recommend you just keep it for yourself. You always keep that running tab for yourself. Sometimes people just need to let that build up for a while, process fear, make sure that they're in a calm place. I've done this myself where you're like, oh, the bully's being nicer. Maybe this will last. It doesn't, but so like sometimes we have to go through that a few times. And so you keep that record there. I always recommend that you engage HR, but engage them carefully. I say this as an HR professional, don't trust them. I am someone who would, never trade my integrity for my job. I've investigated my bosses, I've investigated board members, but sadly I know that the vast majority of folks out there are not trained or they're too afraid to engage. But the reason why you still want to speak to HR is because it puts them on their back foot and it creates a record. so that the HR person, management, your company may be liable for what happened to you. And so by putting them on notice in a calm, respectful manner that says these things happen, it signals to them. You're effectively speaking code that they will understand and may make the hairs on the back of their neck stand up to say, oh, this person might know what they're doing. This person was smart enough to put this in writing. This person's not going to quietly go away if I punch down at them because I don't want to deal with this. And you're setting yourself up to position yourself to get an attorney, to get assistance, and things that they're going to be far more sensitive to. So even if they're weak on their response, it'll be a better response than the folks who just whisper it and don't want to go on the record.
Yeah, that documentation at the time is one lesson I've learned in the past too, is even if you're not documenting it to HR per se, but to your point, have it on your own device so that you've got access to it should you separate from the business for some reason, because that doesn't necessarily end that situation, because there could be long-term implications as you kind of started with. Yeah. To be able to know that you still have access to that, and don't let your memory destroy what actually happened. Like, you're most likely to get it documented the right way immediately, and then as time goes by, it's going to degrade, and you want to make sure to get that, and ideally in a way that is timestamped, so that you can say, look, I created this file about this situation on this day. And that puts that stake in the ground at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even low-tech ways, just text yourself. So when you get home that night, that you can do something there.
I want to touch back on something that you mentioned before about, sometimes you just got to deal with people. And that, to me, when I was younger, early in my career, that was always my thought. Like, I'm the lowest person on the totem pole. I have absolutely no power. I don't know what a work dynamics are supposed to be. I went to school. I went to college. I had my friends. I had my sibling. I had my parents. Work dynamics are very different. And so I remember still, after couple decades now, what that dynamic was like in an office space. And even relearning it when I started going fully remote, as I have been for most of the last decade. And just understanding what was right, what was wrong in that space. So you kind of hit on it a little bit. I want to dig a little bit deeper in that mode of, you just got to deal with jerks. I mean, that's part of being an adult. It is what it is. You just got to learn to deal with it, because you can't really stop it, because people will always be people. How do you respond to somebody that would respond to me sharing, hey, I feel like I was treated improperly here? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so for me, I would take that very seriously. One of my employees came to me, like, as a VP, I would reach out at any level of the organization, in some case, even if it's above me, and say, we need to have a conversation. And so I think it's really important to show that your response is timely, and that people can feel something that has happened. And so, I feel really good when I do an investigation, and I'm not going to betray confidences, but they know if that person's not there or not, or they know if there's a change in behavior, so they know that when the company takes action and when it doesn't. So I know in a lot of cases that doesn't happen. Like, unfortunately, and I'm so sorry that happened to you, and that is horribly common. And so a lot of times what people can do is, if they don't trust HR or they don't trust their management to do things right, talk about how it's in their best interest. And so, a lot of times, like, I'll help people say, like, okay, I hear from healthcare all the time. So, I'm like, let's go do a Google News search. There's not as many hospitals now, but here's hospitals. Here's how many times they've been sued for the exact same treatment. Here's the lawyers who sued them. And so by presenting these information and very calmly saying, like, look, I don't want to go down this road. I don't want to sue you, but I'm scared. I'm feeling really threatened. I feel like I need to do something to protect myself. And I know that I have that right to do that. These are things that are impacting organizations with the exact same set of fact patterns, the exact same set of circumstances. Do you really want to go down this road? We're also seeing, too, where the plaintiff's bar is getting so creative on things, kind of like what I was telling you before on just how they're even looking at contracts. We're seeing shareholders go after public boards. So if bullying goes public, you can see share prices drop very quickly. If somebody makes, NBC or whatever these things happen, like, there's real numbers that are lost, and shareholders will go after boards if they knew about it and didn't do anything, because you've now hurt their investment. And then on top of it, like, New York just passed a workers' comp law not long ago, where if you go to your doctor and you can demonstrate that you're dealing with, psychological abuse at work, you can file a workers' comp claim. I filed a workers' comp claim, for abuse at work. So these types of things are becoming more common. And then my absolute favorite is just Gen Z quick talks where they light people on fire. And they don't even care if they've signed an NDA and it gets 10 million views and it has very real reputational impacts that can impact a bottom line. And so, a lot of times, like when you're dealing with fear and folks who don't want to take that step, just saying like, this stuff comes out now. Do you really want it to come out that, you knew about it and you didn't do anything? Like, how do you think that's going to impact your career? How do you think that's going to impact you and what happens to you? And sometimes we shouldn't have to do that, but sometimes by doing that, it can be really helpful for those conversations.
Yeah, I really like what you said of trying, if there isn't support within the organization directly, like if the person who's experiencing this at work doesn't necessarily feel safe, to go to HR, to thinking about going about it from a different perspective instead of saying like, this is happening to me, about being like, hey, like our organization could become like have issues because of this, because other organizations are struggling with these similar issues too. What are you recommending for companies that are trying to do the right thing? Obviously, if there's a bad apple, right, get rid of the bad apple, right? That's the ideal scenario for most organizations. Is training a part of this as well? Is there even a movement yet to have training for employers of, it seems odd, but to like be kind to one another and not to abuse one another at work? But is that a mindset that might work?
Do you bring in kindergarten teachers to teach them how to get along with one another?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's been the equivalent of that, and I don't know if that's wildly effective. I think if you're not engaging senior leadership in a really concrete way where you've got that critical buy-in, then what you do with the rank and file won't mean as much. It's funny, I work with a lot of wonderful folks, a lot of wonderful consultants who probably will not like me for saying that training's not as effective as, I think some of them are. And we kind of go back and forth. We call ourselves the carrots and the stick. I'm a stick. I'm just like, lawsuits solve problems. They just, it's not pleasant. Nobody likes to go through them. But when companies are sued, they really, that's when the policies come out. That's when they start cleaning house, and so ideally you'd like to prevent that. That's why I try to use some of these leverage points. But I think making sure you don't have a single point of failure is probably the number one thing. Number two is making sure you have fair hiring practices, because over and over again, when you have bullies, what you have is that person who generates too much revenue, that engineer that built something that the whole company lives off of. And so therefore, when people get in this untouchable status, even if they were nice, we start to see these shifts because there's no accountability there. And likewise, we run into that a lot when they're hiring family members, when they're hiring their buddies. They tend to be less excited about engaging with that person when there's a discipline issue, because there's now a personal relationship or a dynamic that's at play. And so, middle parts of the organizations can get really involved in HR, but technically anyone can kind of do this too. Is we had worked out like a formula for calculating the cost of a brilliant jerk is kind of another leverage point. And so in an HR context where you have like an HRIS that has all your employee payroll data and things like that, we came up with something with Rippling where I tested myself, not a brilliant jerk, just a plain old jerk. And so to kind of call me out a little bit, I did my 360 and I gave myself a 5 out of 5. Asked my boss to give me a 5 out of 5 because jerks are usually protected by their bosses, so that's consistent. And then I had my direct reports, my peers, give me 1s. And so we trained the system to automatically flag anyone in that category where you had that bigger discrepancy. And then we came up with a rough formula that has actually been around for a long time based on performance and engagement. And so a highly engaged employee is usually giving you a 90% return on that paycheck. After dentists and vacations and all that other stuff, this is what you can expect to get. Average employees are around 60%, and a really disengaged employee is around 30%. So the ones who are going to get it the worst are going to be my direct reports. So we went ahead and just took 30% of their pay. And so in other words, like we've lost 70%. And then for my peers, who may not be dealing with me as much, but they're still having to manage me, they're having to avoid me at meetings, or they're having to go through extra hoops in order to deal with me, we just cut them in half. And so in my own case, just by having a couple peers and direct reports, I was able to show that my ugly behavior cost the company $250,000. And that's just a small company. So we've done this with other folks at big companies where big salaries are at stake, and you're seeing millions of dollars in some cases. So am I still worth that trouble? If I bring in $500,000 of sales, but you're instantly losing half of it because I'm just a not nice person, is that okay? And it can actually go further, because like if my direct reports are suffering so bad and they have direct reports, are they able to take care of them? Are they, how is that functioning? So it could be even kind of more legs to that.
Yeah, because it's not about the individual's performance, it's about how they affect everyone around them.
Yeah.
Is going to start to topple. Just like dominoes, they'll hit others, and that's kind of disturbing when you put numbers like that together.
And anyone can technically do it. I mean, anyone, with pay transparency in most states, if jobs go on the record, and if you have a team of analysts and you're all at roughly the same grade, you can just multiply your own salary. So there's ways you can kind of roughly pull these numbers together if you're trying to pitch to an HR that may be hesitant to move.
So walk us through, too, where are you at with this movement of actually getting this bill to light? And how can we get a little bit more involved on that?
Thank you. Yeah. So at In Workplace Abuse, we've been working on the Workplace Psychological Safety Act that would give a private cause of action if your employer knows about abuse and doesn't do anything. So what that basically means is you can sue them. Same way you can if you have a race discrimination case or a sexual harassment case. And so basically what this bill does is it decouples protected characteristics from harassment. So that EEOC definition of harassment, we actually say, you know what, that's just terrible all by itself. Like, you don't have to read someone's mind and say, oh, they did this to me because I'm a woman or because of my race or ethnicity, which can be very, very difficult to prove in 2025, but also ignores so many other categories. Like, it could leave Brian out of the equation, and he may be legitimately suffering from these things but have no cause of action. And then what's even more disgusting and more awful is if I'm working with the two of you and I'm the nightmare and I treat both of you bad, well, now there's no gender claim because I'm an equal opportunity jerk. And so that gets you off the hook. It's now no longer unlawful harassment. And so this bill seeks to correct that. It's actually been around for quite a long time. It took quite a while to get off the ground. 19, it went before the Massachusetts House Labor Committee. 1,000 people submitted testimony. Really big names flew out there and testified, including Fox News whistleblower Gretchen Carlson, Weinstein whistleblower Rowena Chu. I testified. A lot of medical doctors testified. That's where I first started learning about some of the real health harms that were taking place there. It didn't make it all the way through, but it's coming back up, and so they'll be looking for testimony again this fall, and anyone can testify. So any state, anyone can make a comment. I think we've reached like 20% of all lawmakers in the United States, where folks have reached out, signed petitions on in-workplace abuse, saying, I want this in my city, my state, wherever you are. I'm working with the District of Columbia right now. So we have one city council member that's offered to co-introduce the bill. We're working with the labor chair to bring them on board so that we can bring this to the District of Columbia. It passed the full Senate in Rhode Island. It's being fast-tracked through the House right now through a special committee. So we wait every day to see if there's news there, because we've had good signals from the governor that she will sign. And so therefore, we could have our very first bill. This is also active in New York City, Pennsylvania, Hawaii. We're looking to have movement in Connecticut potentially this year. And we have teams in 25 states that are looking to start introducing this. But the movement itself has grown wildly. I think it's increased, or it's tripled in size just over the last 2 years. And so we've gotten a lot more national press coverage. We have almost 150 organizations, including 2 awesome organizations here who co-signed the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. And we're always looking for more. Lawmakers love to hear that, businesses and organizations care about this too. And we find that a lot do. And we actually found in working with a lot of small businesses that the number one reason why small businesses start is because of workplace abuse. That people left a toxic culture and decide to go into business for themselves just to be free of something like that. So if folks are interested, they can reach out to me or, connect with someone through inworkplaceabuse.com and say, I'd love to lend my name, my voice. And we also blast out. We have over 250,000 social media followers, and we talk about these great organizations like, this is who you should work for. This is who you should do business with. This is who you support. Like, these are the kinds of people we need in the world. And so we do everything we can to love the folks that also join us in this.
No, that all sounds fantastic. Obviously, these types of things tend to be, we've used the word movement. I totally agree with that in this case, because it's make people aware that the situation exists, get some legislative wins under your belt, and then it starts to snowball from there. So it sounds like you're hitting that snowball phase, which is really awesome to hear. And yeah, I would encourage people to, and we'll put a link to the End Workplace Abuse website where you can go and sign up and join that petition if you have interest in there. And I know you've got a bunch of information about the different bills going through, and not just on this one, but other related topics as well. So maybe talk about some of those other ones that people should be looking out for.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of kind of more progressive bills moving through places like Minnesota, and as well as, was it Connecticut? I think that they're looking at doing, you're seeing a really big attack on NSAs, which is really kind of critical and adjacent to this too.
What would NSAs be?
So those are non-disclosure agreements. Sorry, not NSA, NDAs.
NDA.
Sorry. Yeah, no wonder that was confusing. Yeah, no, sorry, NDAs. And so, because what makes that so difficult is a lot of times, like when you're applying for a job, they can work NDAs in there so that you can't talk publicly about that. Or if you take a settlement, they try and do things where you can't talk publicly. That may not always be true even now. And so, you can still talk to your doctor. You can still talk to your therapist. You can still talk to your lawyer. I've done 70 podcasts where I talked about suing my boss. I don't say which one, so I'm not violating my NDA, but I talk about it in these broad strokes because I learned some painful lessons I don't want other people to have to go through from scratch, and if I can help other people navigate that space, I definitely want to do that. So it's not necessarily fully there, but we're seeing a lot of movement there where states are beginning to say, hey, if this is dealing with employment discrimination or sexual harassment or some of these other things, your NDA is null and void. The workers' comp one that I touched upon too, we're starting to see a lot more activity happening there, which I also think is really encouraging because like a very long time ago, the United States decided that you're entitled to a safe workplace. And so if someone pushes you down a flight of stairs, somebody's going to have to make you whole for that. And so, when we look at some of these really awful cases where people have committed suicide or they're getting very sick, or the financial ruin, and, more than half of people who go through workplace abuse like this will end up in extremely terrible financial straits. That we're starting to see at least some form of accountability or some acknowledgement that workplace safety also includes the psychological element, because as we discussed, it's not invisible. It shows up in divorces, it shows up in lost homes, it shows up in homelessness and cancer and all these other things.
Wild. Yeah. Wild. Kim, thank you so much for giving us some additional background on it. I'm so impressed with what you're doing. So keep the fight going for sure. We're happy to be involved, and we're also just really grateful for you walking us through about what this is, what you're doing at the end workplace abuse with the movement. I'm going to call it a movement, but we're excited to see those bills moving through the state governments and the legislatures. I do want to just give some cohesivity. I know this wasn't necessarily a security focused topic, but I definitely still want to give you the opportunity, especially with your background in human resources, to weigh in on whether or not you think there's a valuable fight to privacy. So a couple years ago, I had a chief technology officer tell me that he felt like the fight for privacy was dead and that now organizations really need to just focus on security. So do you believe that there's still a valuable fight, or where do you kind of fall on?
Oh yeah, there's no privacy anymore. HR is in everybody's business. I mean, it's kind of interesting now, when people do awful stuff at work, investigations write themselves in 2025, and so it's actually mind-blowing what people say on Teams chats and video calls. And I even had someone one time on a tense call use the chat AI feature to say, describe the tone of the call, and it said it was abusive, and they just poured all of it into HR, and it's all recorded and transcribed. And so I feel like between that and ChatGPT and everything else and our Google search history, all that, I feel like, I think that ship sailed a long time ago.
Very interesting. Cool. Well, Kim, I also appreciate you joining us. I'm a big fan of what you're doing, and keep up the good fight for all of us. Hopefully this will lead to more people joining you in that fight. I'm definitely here for that as well, so excited to see how this all plays out. Final word that you would have for people, and let us know how, if people want to contact you, how best they can do that.
Yeah, no, I'm old-timey. I'm only on LinkedIn, so I try to post and give advice and things like that there. You can also DM me anytime if you ever need help. I'm always there. I know what it feels like, so I'm always happy to talk people, through what they can do. I think one really good piece of advice is consider an attorney. One thing I do love about the plaintiff side, or employee side, employment law is, unlike big law, which tends to represent big companies, most of the folks that engage in this space have huge hearts. They're civil rights focused. A lot of them have gone into this because it happened to them or it happened to someone that they loved. And so, I found in my experience that a lot of times, if you're not sure what to do, reach out, and they may say you don't have a case yet, but if X, Y, and Z happens, do this. And, and a lot of times they will tell you how to document, how to do these things, but there's so many more resources out there. And so for anyone who's out there who's hurting, you deserve better. You just absolutely deserve better.
Yep, I love that. Great. Well, I think that we'll wrap up there, and we appreciate, Kim, you joining us, and to the audience, we appreciate you joining us, and we hope that this was useful. Even though it wasn't a technical topic today, we have done past episodes on mental health, and I think that's a big topic for both Milou and I, so hopefully you all found this useful, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Kim.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.